Hey, everybody, welcome back to It's Time. Lindsley and I are really, really pleased, honored, privileged to bring to you today Dr. Wendy Troxel. So, I've gotten to know Wendy for the last few years. She's a sleep expert, and I know that's one of my biggest struggles currently in my life is how to sleep with the changes that are happening. And I love about every time I talk to Wendy, she's not only a scientist and a researcher, she's a psychologist, she's an author, she's a speaker, is she has great advice and her research is focused on how we sleep in real life. So it's not a lab condition and say translate these things from the lab to your home, which most of us know is not really practical. And so I'm just really excited to dive into the psychology we have around sleep, and that includes everything from environment to bed partner to, whether those are dogs, cats, humans, whatever. And then some really practical takeaways about not only what we can do tangibly to sleep better, but how we can kind of even adjust our mindset about what is normal as we get older, and what opportunities are there to change and evolve that we may not be super familiar with. So we're so excited to have you.
I am so excited to be here, Jen. It's such a pleasure, and so nice to be here with you as well, Lindsley. I think we're going to have a great conversation, and it's a
So
real honor
excited.
for me as well.
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, would you start just by kind of sharing your work and what you do and kind of the things that you have really inspired you to stay in the sleep field and do the research that you're doing?
So, yes, I can kind of give you my story a little bit. I am trained as a licensed clinical psychologist, and I've spent my career, the past 2 decades, primarily doing research with a small clinical practice on the side. But my research really has focused throughout my career on exploring more of a social lens on sleep. So I'm very much focused on the role of sleep as it relates to health and performance and productivity and health span. But within that lens of looking at how sleep impacts these health outcomes, I really apply a social lens to sleep. And that's, I think, what's kind of set my work apart from the beginning of my career. As you said, I study sleep in the real world, in the wild, as it occurs, as it's messy and noisy and interrupted. And I think that's so important because it's the only way that we're going to really be able to truly understand what's going on with people in their homes, what their struggles are, and then ultimately help them find solutions and strategies to, sleep better, even in the constraints and sort of environments that just happen to exist as being human beings who have social lives, have partners, have children, have pets, who live in various neighborhoods, who live in cities or rural communities. All of these things really require taking a more social lens to sleep, which is really not how the field of sleep has emerged.
Yeah, I mean, I love how you approach this work in reality-based environments. It's like many people, they have a partner or they have a pet or they have children or they travel or, they're in their 20s and they're working nonstop. It's like there are some things about sleep that it's great that we've all heard them in the last couple of years, but sometimes they feel unattainable
Yeah.
in the world and the environment that we're just really authentically living in. So I so appreciate that lens that you bring to the sleep opportunity.
Well, thank you. Well, and even today, I mean, from a sleep science perspective, when you look at how sleep has traditionally been studied and measured, it's been in sleep laboratory conditions, which are very isolated and quiet. It really tries to isolate the individual's experience as much as possible, but that often looks nothing like people's sleep in their real lives.
Right.
And by the same token, and so that kind of leads to certain discrepancies between what we can measure in the lab and what we see what's happening in people's real homes. But what I'm also seeing now beyond the sleep laboratory, and now many sleep scientists, such as myself, we have taken our measurements into the home, and there's lots of technology to do so. So we can do this sort of sleep in the wild measurement and analysis much more effectively now. But it's not just the sleep lab that's kind of perpetuated this myth of sleep being this sort of laboratory experiment. I think now, with all the focus on sleep that we see in sort of discussions of, health and performance and longevity and health span, there's also a bit of this attitude that we are these lab rats who can completely, obsess over our sleep and perfect it, and that that our sleep is entirely our own. And I think we know as women that that is simply not the case. And it's an unrealistic expectation that can often set people up for failure. So I'm really also tuned into trying to disabuse people of that idea that we are in any position, nor should we be trying to perfect sleep.
Will you take us back through kind of what's happening in midlife and why that is impacting our sleep? I think it's always so important to go back and, I know for me, like 2 years ago, I slept great, and now it's like, I know it's 3 a.m. and I'm wide awake and it's just the new normal. But what is happening physiologically in our bodies, especially as midlife women, as when our sleep starts to degrade?
Yeah. So I think this will come as a surprise to none of your listeners. But sleep disturbances, I'm here to tell you, sleep disturbances are actually very common during midlife for women in particularly. And when we talk about midlife, we're really talking about sort of, mid 40s, and beyond. And that's really, it coincides with the sort of average onset of perimenopause and the menopausal transition. Entire menopausal transition, which includes both perimenopause and postmenopause, that takes most women on average about a decade to go through. So again, for many women, it's starting sort of mid 40s and carrying forward. And what we know is during the entire menopausal transition, there are a number of symptoms associated with menopause, including, so the big ones, vasomotor symptoms, which would include hot flashes and night sweats. These are powerful disruptors of sleep. And this is happening during the menopausal transition as a result of a very sort of fluctuating hormonal milieu, as both progesterone and estrogen levels are changing. But I always want to emphasize to people, it's not just the hot flashes and night sweats that are disrupting sleep at midlife. There is also a sort of independent likelihood of nighttime awakenings, and it's typically that 2 or 3 a.m. So unfortunately, even if you don't experience hot flashes or night sweats, you may still experience those 3 a.m. awakenings. And we're not entirely sure what the cause is. Again, certainly there is a dynamic, changing hormonal climate that could contribute to the sleep disturbances. But we also know it's not just that, because if it were, we would have solved the problem. And while taking hormone replacement therapy can be an effective strategy to support sleep for some women, it's really not a panacea. It does not work for all women. It does not work for all sleep symptoms. So there are other strategies as well. But ultimately, what it is this sort of midlife transition is a profoundly important time of change, both hormonally, but also psychologically for women. I think that we don't pay attention to that nearly as much as we should. And because those psychological issues, including the fact that this is a big time of transition in terms of your role as a parent, as a spouse, in your employment. We live in a population that really makes youth a virtue. And so there's a lot of pressure on women during this stage. And all of that, combined with the hormonal and other physical changes, can really compound to impact negatively women's sleep.
So I have one follow-up question on that really quickly. A lot of the things that I've read talk about really sleep often being the first symptom, or difficulty with sleep, lack of sleep being the first symptom of kind of entering this perimenopausal transition. And from what I've read, and I would just love for you to validate that this is actually good science or what I'm reading is total nonsense, is more, we're heading into those anovulatory periods. So we might still be having a period, but we're not ovulating. So we're not getting the corpus luteum that's making the progesterone. And so it's actually really kind of the one really primary place where lack of progesterone is showing up, and that is sleep. Is truth to that, not truth to that?
Absolute truth to it, but I would caution that we then interpret that as a one-to-one relationship, that you have a decline in progesterone and therefore you have sleep problems, because that would suggest just give everybody progesterone and their sleep problems will remit. Unfortunately, and I really want to say this to your audience, as much as I am in favor of women considering hormone therapy options for treating various symptoms, unfortunately, when it comes to sleep, it is not a guarantee, it is not a cure-all. And I really want to say that because I think otherwise, if we send this message that makes people think that it is this one-to-one relationship, then it can make people feel even more desperate
Mm-hmm.
that, oh my gosh, like I started on HRT and I still have sleep problems. I'm a hopeless case. That's not the case, because we know that while taking hormones can be effective for some women in terms of mitigating sleep problems, it's not so effective for others. So that's where we want to look at other strategies.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things about your work that makes it so accessible for people is this: it's based in a grounded reality of real life environments, right? So, because I think the good news is we've heard a lot about sleep and that it's important. So, this idea of, sleep when you die is going away. People value sleep now and understand it's important. But I think the flip side of that is a lot of people are now like stressing about sleep. They're like, I'm not doing it right. I heard one of my friends was like, yeah, I think of sleep like a sport, like I'm just trying to train for it. It's like, that's a lot of pressure to deliver on sleep. Like, what are some of the real world environmental impacts of trying to just have a good night's rest? And how can we help women feel comfortable with that reality and still hopefully get a little more sleep?
Yeah, well, and let me try to tie this into to something that Jen had just said too about, sleep disturbances kind of being a bit of a canary in the mine, that they're often sort of the earliest symptoms before someone has experienced hot flashes or night sweats. We start to see some of these changes in sleep. And what's really important to know is, first of all, just because the symptoms are common, about 60% of women at midlife will experience some form of sleep disturbances, with those middle of the night awakenings being the most common. What's really interesting is just because it's common doesn't mean it's inevitable that you have to suffer for 10 years. And so I also want to make that clear. And what's really interesting, we talked about, yes, there's a role of hormones, but it's not a one-to-one relationship. Honestly, what happens, and this is where it's so important that we, again, sort of realize what's happening in women's real lives when this is happening and address the symptoms early on. I think if we could do this, we could make such a difference in women's lives. Because what we know about the development of chronic sleep disturbances, which women are twice as likely to have as compared to men, such as insomnia, that whatever the cause may be, and there could be lots of different causes across the lifespan, what we think makes insomnia become a chronic and really debilitating condition is that it essentially becomes a learned behavior. So the fact that all of us may have an occasional 3 a.m. awakening is not in and of itself a problem, because actually sleep in the real world is a dynamic state. We expect some level of awakenings in the middle of the night. That's part of the process of sleep. It's not a coma. And I think a lot of people think that sleep should be a coma. It's not. So when you think that, okay, middle of the night awakenings, happen, and they may happen more frequently as we get older because we might need to use the bathroom, or maybe we have a child still who wakes us up. Some people at this stage still have young children, so that you have to factor
Or
that in.
teenagers who are not home yet. That's another thing that wakes me up.
Exactly. Or a partner who snores, all these things. You might have a greater propensity to wake up. The challenge becomes when you develop a learned habit of not falling back to sleep. And what happens within that habit is it's not just that you're lying there blissfully enjoying your rest. You start to develop a habit of being awake and frustrated in bed. And that's really the opportunity and the target of the most effective interventions for insomnia in women at midlife and really across the lifespan. So we can really treat it actually as breaking a habit. And the more we could address this earlier on, when women first start experiencing these strange 3 a.m. awakenings, instead of lying there in bed, awake and gritting your teeth and starting to worry about your day or making your lists, my suggestion is actually to get out of bed. To get out of bed and go do something relaxing, distracting, like reading a book or listening to a podcast, and then return to bed when you're sleepy. If we can break that habit, then
Mm.
a one-off sleep disturbance doesn't become a chronic and debilitating disorder. That's really where we could see tremendous benefit for women, particularly if we caught it earlier.
What about I'm going to say social, maybe that's not even the right word, but social stress of when this starts to happen, right? We're having more awakenings, whether we're frustrated or getting up and out of bed. We then have a bed partner who may be disturbed by that too, and starting to cause, short term, not a big deal, every night can start to cause then tension in that relationship as well. What are your I know this, you spent a lot of your time researching this. What are your recommendations about that? Because you can just see how that can snowball really quickly, that I'm not sleeping, I'm getting up all night, once or twice, not a big deal, every night for 6 months, becoming a much bigger deal.
Yes, absolutely. And as you mentioned, it can quickly become a vicious cycle. And the person that you're most likely to take out your bad moods on is likely your partner. And this vicious cycle can emerge not only because there are direct impacts of insufficient or poor quality sleep on, our mood levels, our emotions, our irritability, our anger, our frustration tolerance, even our likelihood of developing depression or anxiety. Furthermore, during the menopausal transition, we also know that this is also a heightened time of risk for mood disorders. So you really have this kind of perfect storm of factors that can contribute to sleep disturbances at night, leading to bad moods during the day, and then lashing out at your partner. So one of the recommendations that I make in my book about couples and sleep is actually to label what's going on, but do it judiciously. So, we have a word, hangry, for when you're, hungry, and get angry. And I definitely experience that. I'm not fun to be around. But like, why can't we also label it when it's feeling slangry? If
Yeah.
you're sleep deprived and you're angry, again, it cannot be a perpetual excuse. But I think allowing partners to label, wow, I am just not at my best self because I've had, several nights of really bad sleep. Give me a little distance and know that if I lash out, it's really not about you. I'm just,
Yeah.
I'm in a state that is compromised versus it being sort of a dispositional, I'm just a jerk all the time. So I think that effectively labeling what's happening, but then also ensuring that you're doing everything you can to get your needs met, to get better sleep. And that might be doing more things to be more protective about your sleep without being, as you said, Lindsay, sort of obsessive or perfectionistic about it, because again, we have to sort of have reasonable expectations, not perfectionistic ones.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the first time I had an understanding of how hard sleep deprivation is when we had babies, right? That's the first time you really, and I mean, Jen went through it, and you did as well as doctors, like, staying up 24/7. But I really had not experienced that. But because I had, real noticeable mood and outlook perspectives after sleep deprivation for what ended up being like 5 years with three babies close together. When I got into midlife, I took it more seriously. It was like, this is actually something to pay attention to, because the downstream effects of it are high impact and big ripples. So giving people
Absolutely. Yeah.
permission with that terminology is a great way for them to be like, this is a thing. I'm slangry, and I don't have real control over it. I just am right now.
Right. And again, it sort of contextualizes it. It's not an excuse forever, but it contextualizes it. It allows you and your partner potentially to engage and be teammates about it and say, so how do we address this? What can we do in the short term to protect your sleep, to get you through, just like you had to when you were sleep deprived with newborns. What's
Yeah.
interesting about your story is that was actually one of the many reasons why I became so fascinated about couples and sleep, because I started my career as a relationship researcher studying the role of relationships and health, but I started to look at these times in relationships where we see a precipitous decline in marital satisfaction. One
Mhm.
of the most profound points where couples take a deep dive or a steep dive in their relationship satisfaction is around the birth of their first child. It also happens to be a time where we see dramatic increases in insufficient sleep and poor sleep quality, particularly in the mother, but also in the father. So I realized that, wow, we need to start looking again at the couple level,
Mhm.
times in our lives where sleep disturbances are more likely, and then to understand the impact on the relationship. And from that, can we intervene at the level of the relationship by giving couples tools to support each other? And can we also intervene at the level of sleep to benefit the relationship? So that was really a driver for my work.
Yeah. Well, I can see why. It's a surprising catalyst, right? You're like, where
Yeah.
did this come from? Yeah. But as we talk about it, like, Jen's brought up the example of waking up at 3 a.m., which so many of us know very well. Like, you're like, hey, it's 3 a.m. I'm going to get up in a couple hours anyway. What do I do? But it feels like there's like, okay, you wake up, you can't go back to sleep. And that's a disturbance. There's the, you can't fall asleep. And then there's this, like, you constantly wake up through the night. Like, are there categories of sleep challenges that you kind of bucket and say, here's some suggestions for each one of these categories? Or are the suggestions the same regardless of which one is disruptive?
I'm so glad you're asking that because I would be remiss to not mention that, middle of the night awakenings, which we would call a symptom of insomnia predominantly, though it could be something else. That's just, that is the most common sleep disorder, but there's actually over 70 diagnosable sleep disorders. And we know that beyond this, very dramatic increases in insomnia rates during the menopausal transition, we also see increases in other sleep disorders, which can have similar symptoms. So it's not only insomnia that women need to be aware of. First of all, we know obstructive sleep apnea, which is a type of sleep disordered breathing where the upper airway collapses during sleep, causing snoring or gasping for air and reductions in overall oxygen levels and poor quality sleep. And it can look during the day like I'm tired all the time. I just don't get good night's sleep. We know that in women are lower risk of apnea before menopause, though apnea actually happens to be very underdiagnosed in women. So the actual statistics are a little bit fuzzy, but actually postmenopausal women have nearly the same rates of apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, as men. So we lose that protective advantage in part due to losing estrogen levels. So obstructive sleep apnea is one that goes far underdiagnosed in women. It is an issue for more women than know it. Symptoms there include things like feeling tired or sleepy during the day, or kind of constant lethargy, having, snoring or gasping for air, waking up with headaches. Often with women, this gets diagnosed as either insomnia or depression. So I
Hmm.
just want to call that out, that again, there's a collection of symptoms that could be very different from your sort of traditional insomnia. Insomnia is difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, or poor quality sleep. So that's sort of the most common. But then there's also other sleep disorders that have rising prevalence during the menopausal transition, like restless leg syndrome, where you
Mm.
feel twitchy feelings in your legs or the need to move
Yeah.
upon falling asleep. So people who have trouble falling asleep, it's possible that this is a symptom of restless legs. It's also possible it's a symptom of iron deficiency, as iron deficiency is a primary contributor to restless leg syndrome. So this is all why it's so important to be having this conversation. It's not this monolithic, all sleep problems in women are that 3 a.m. awakenings. Yes,
Mhm.
that's a very common one, but sleep can go awry in lots of ways. And the treatments really depend on what the root of the problem is.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up the sleep apnea thing. It was on my list to make sure we covered today because I think it's. Will you explain a little bit more how you mentioned it briefly, but I think I really want our listeners to understand how different it can look in women,
Hmm.
and how really we actually have to kind of actively seek to be evaluated for it because we don't meet. I mean, I'll put my medical hat on. We don't meet the sleep apnea criteria that I'm
Yeah.
taught in medical school as a physician,
Yeah.
right? It would be very unlikely for me to screen most women because they're going to say, or to pick up
Yes.
on their sleep apnea because they're going to say no to all of my traditional
Exactly.
screening
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. And I mean, as Jen's raising this, I mean, I do have sleep apnea. The only reason I went to get it diagnosed is because my mom and all of her brothers have it as, 70, 80-year olds. And they supposedly had it for a long time before it really manifested strongly enough for them to go get tested. So I was like, oh, I should have it checked out because we're in this world where Jen and I are checking everything. But I would not have, and my doctor would not have asked me to check it if I didn't have that input.
Well, I mean, you are sort of the poster child of who, if you weren't sort of actively advocating for yourself, I can tell you there is no way, a thin, healthy woman would be screened for apnea. You wouldn't. The sort of characteristic and sort of the presumption of the apnea patient is an overweight male, who snores and is excessively sleepy during the day. The truth is, women do get apnea. Thin women do get apnea, as well as overweight women. So, thinness or overweight, even though overweight is a risk factor for obstructive sleep apnea, there's other causes of apnea, including probably in your family's history, some anatomic features, just sort of the structure of your neck or your palate. So again, the people who don't, scream, a classic apnea patient, which are most women, this is why we have to advocate for ourselves. And when it comes to symptoms, it's rare that women with apnea are, that the primary symptom is that they're snoring like a freight train. But whereas with, many of the couples who come to see me, it's often a male apnea patient who is snoring like a freight train, and his wife who comes in complaining of insomnia
Yeah.
from him keeping her up. But it does not necessarily have to be the loud snoring. The excessive sleepiness is often not a symptom, in part because I think many women just have to get through their day. So yes,
Not often.
you might describe fatigue or lethargy. And again, it's very quick for doctors that looks a lot like depression, which, there's a lot of overlap, but they are distinct. So in women, it can be very different. It might be experiencing more of the headaches in the morning, or again, just that lethargy and fatigue. And we did a study on this to show that when we measured apnea objectively in women versus sort of the standard survey measures of symptoms, there was just very little consistency or alignment between what a doctor would typically ask to screen for apnea and, the objective evidence that some of these women who would screen negative were actually showing significant apnea. So it's really just another reminder, particularly as women approach midlife and menopause, given that we know rates of sleep apnea go up, way up, that it just should be another thing on the radar to leave no stone unturned. And you do have to advocate for yourself.
What would you recommend? I mean, I feel like everyone wears some sort of wearable at this point in time. I guess this is a two-part question. Do you think that we can get good data from a wearable that would clue us in as a midlife woman that sleep apnea might actually be what's happening? And so we can kind of have a little data behind going to our physician being concerned about it? Or are there specific things that we should be looking at in our data that we may not know could be a sign of disordered breathing at night?
Yeah, I mean, there is so much emerging technology out there that can really sort of support efforts to identify symptoms that you might otherwise not be aware of. Many trackers do have, a snoring function. There are even apps that can measure that, that you just put your phone next to your bed, although I generally don't like your phone next to your bed, that can measure snoring or gasping for air. There's other sort of biometrics that can be useful, but they aren't super specific. Things like heart rate variability. If you see sort of some rapid or sort of abrupt changes, that might be useful. And again, if you're showing both in your tracker as well as in your own subjective experience that you're routinely feeling like your sleep is of poor quality, that you're waking up frequently, or you just, even with sufficient rest, you wake up and you just don't feel like you had a good night of sleep. All of that can be an indicator that something is awry with your sleep, whether it be insomnia or apnea. And again, I think that there's emerging technologies that are constantly improving that will allow us to do this even better in our homes. I would say right now, I think there's some level of over-promising what devices can do, but they can be a really good signal combined with your own, experiences of your sleep and your own, other characteristics of your health history.
Well, so if we were going to think about like the reality where people are sleeping, with partners, or as we talked about this a little bit before we started our conversation on the podcast, is like it's summertime, people are traveling. Like, are there some things that are accessible for people that you'd say, hey, you got in one situation, you have a partner who's keeping you up, maybe the snoring partner. One situation, you're the partner who's waking up, like Jen was describing, like it's like you were waking up with insomnia. What are practical things in those contexts? And then what about the traveling dynamic where you're on the road? How do you manage your sleep when you're out of your predictable environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just wrote an article about this because, hotels and are starting to sort of, take on a more sleep forward perspective and starting to try to address some of these issues that people do experience. So I think that's a really good sign. It is challenging when we travel. One of the things about our sleep is that, I always talk about, to support healthy sleep, and this is again from the social lens, we want to be in an environment that makes us feel safe and secure. So that includes who we sleep with, the environment that we're in. And when you travel to an unfamiliar environment, that can make you feel less safe or less secure. So, doing things, practical strategies to bring a little bit of home with you can be very helpful, particularly if you're, for instance, traveling alone away from your family. That might be helpful to bring a piece of clothing from your loved one to have a little scent or a pillowcase just to bring that familiarity to the new environment. If you're traveling with a partner and you have certain arrangements at home to deal with, whether your partner snores or tosses and turns, or if you have different schedules, I think the best sort of strategies there are to, use some sort of practical tools, bring an eye mask, have earplugs on hand. Like these things can be helpful. And, I think as with many things, there's a million varieties on the market. You might need to, experiment and try the strategies that are going to work best for you.
Mm-hmm.
Then when you actually think of the hotel itself, again, like I said, there's a lot of hotels that are moving in this direction of being more forward thinking in terms of supporting sleep as being really the most critical aspect of the hotel stay.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are many hotels still in the dark or not dark because they'll have poor lighting conditions. There'll be light streaming in from outside or maybe underneath the door to the hallway. So I actually do have colleagues who will bring a full on sort of retrofitting sleep kit to their hotel room. So that might look like having duct tape, having, to sort of tape the
Yeah.
curtains down. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
having your eye mask, always making sure to unplug the alarm clock that's in the room, which always has sort of a flashing LED
Yeah.
light, which can
Yeah.
really interfere with your sleep. So there are things that you can do. And then behaviorally, trying as much as possible on vacation to follow as consistent a schedule as you can as you would at home. There's also the issue of jet lag and things like that if you're adjusting to a time zone. But you want to pretty quickly establish some regularity in your routine because regularity in your routine also signals to the brain that the world is safe and secure. It's another signal of familiarity, which can also support healthy sleep.
Yeah. One of the things I started doing was using white noise at home so that when I use it at a hotel, it's the same sound. And so
Yeah.
that's helped me better than
Yeah.
earplugs.
So you have that consistency built in and
Yeah.
brought with you.
Yeah. Is there any tool that you have heard about in your research? I'm thinking about my husband specifically, where he's like, he needs a super firm bed to go to sleep. And of course, when you travel, like super squishy beds are everywhere. Is there any kind of like tool you've heard about that helps beds be more
Good
sleep
question.
Yeah, I'm
forward?
actually not certain of a strategy to, I mean, other than sleeping on the floor, that would be a very firm bed. You could always
Yeah.
remember that. Yeah, no, I mean, I think, there's, you're probably giving somebody a great idea because there's, great innovation happening in mattress technology. What I do
Yeah,
know about, and I talk about quite regularly, again, from my couples and sleep work, is that, another great innovation is sort of how, mattresses and bedding are now offering options for an individualized
for
experience,
sure. Yeah, we
but
definitely use
while
that at
sharing a
home.
bed. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah, because
both
we
in terms of the firmness of the bed, the positioning, even the cooling, which is so important for couples where, again,
yeah.
you might be running hot and he's running cold. So allowing those individualized preferences is allowing many couples to continue sharing a bed while honoring their individual preferences and needs.
Okay,
So,
what do you
oh,
think
sorry.
about mouth taping?
I also just wrote an article or contributed to an
Yeah.
article about this. Here's the thing. It is becoming wildly popular as a result of primarily a series of TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube videos by, people who are not sleep experts or doctors primarily. And while I think there's a limited amount of evidence that for a very specific population, including those who definitely do not have moderate or severe apnea. For people who have mild apnea or are simple snorers, there might be some benefits to mouth taping. The problem is that many people don't know whether or not they have apnea. And taping your mouth shut, if you have a significant sleep disorder like apnea, is really problematic and potentially dangerous. So I understand people's motivation to follow influencers who are describing this as the cure-all because people are very desperate for sleep and it seems so simple and kind of too good to be true. And I would say I think it is too good to be true and potentially harmful for some people. So rather than jumping to the mouth tape, I really would encourage people who are having trouble sleeping to talk to their doctor about it. And there's other strategies to try. The sort of idea behind mouth tape that nasal breathing is good for you, that is a real thing and supported by science. But there's other strategies to support nasal breathing that don't involve taping your mouth shut. So I would say exercise caution, and if you're going to do it, really ensure that you don't have another condition like sleep apnea.
I want to go back to this idea about sharing a bed. And I know you've studied this extensively. You've written a book on it, which we'll make sure we reference when we get finished up here in a few minutes. And about how you counsel couples when it's maybe time to not share a bed and all of those worries and concerns that come with maybe making that change. Especially since probably many people have had a bed partner for a significant amount of their lives. But so how do you counsel people to maybe that they're headed in that direction, or maybe that's a reasonable thing to try at some point? And what reassurances do you have, or stories can you share with us about it's not as drastic or as damaging to relationships as we might think it is on the surface?
Right. Well, there is a huge sort of stigma around, and the meaning of the marital bed, right? We hold it as this really sacred thing. And for many people, even considering the idea of, a sleep divorce, which is, a very negative term just for people who choose to sleep apart, that's really stemming from this, societal belief that sleeping apart is necessarily the sign that a relationship is on the rocks. And that's really not the case. I can give you many, many examples of couples who have essentially decided to prioritize sleep for the sake of their relationship. And so will therefore say that sleeping apart was the best decision they made to support their relationship as well as their own emotional health and physical health. But what's key there, and I think relates to the other part of your question about how I work with couples when they come to me with this issue, is it really has to be an active and intentional decision. Not what many couples do, which is sort of a reactive in the middle of the night. I'm so fed up. My partner has been snoring all night or tossing and turning or stealing my sheets. And I'm just going to take my blanket and, stomp out of the room and go to another bedroom or the couch. That sort of reactive pattern can look a lot like abandonment and can hurt the relationship. But couples who are able to actively discuss the issues, what's working, what's not working, to be able to say, honey, I'm just feeling like I can't be a good partner to you because I'm not sleeping well. And that opens the door to this being a relationship enhancing conversation, not a damaging one. And what I encourage couples to do is to have these open and honest dialogues, ideally when you're well rested. Doesn't happen, this is not a conversation to have at 2 a.m. And to really focus on the value of being well rested for you and your partner as a critical component of relationship health. And for many couples, it does seem like such a big step and it feels like kind of all or nothing. I might even suggest try it as an experiment because maybe it's not the solution for you. It's certainly not a solution for everyone. And I'm never prescribing one sleeping arrangement from another because every couple is different in terms of their needs. But maybe you try this out, over a weekend. You collect your own data, you talk with your partner about it. Like, did we actually sleep better? How do we feel during our day? And then maybe, you choose to continue to sleep apart, at least on an occasional basis, and then have wonderful reunions, during some point in the week. So it doesn't have to be this all or nothing. And sometimes just allowing for that sort of experimental, let's try this out, feels a lot less threatening for couples. And again, you might learn that, oh, it actually wasn't my partner that's keeping me up. I just have insomnia, for instance, and I've had many couples who have come to me swearing, and often it is the female partner, really looking for me to sort of push them in the direction towards sleeping apart because she swears that it's her partner that's, causing the problem. And I'll gently suggest that maybe they want to try this as an experiment. And particularly if he's resistant to the idea. And, sometimes they find, oh, this definitely helped both of us. And then sometimes they don't. And she'll realize, I was still waking up at 3 a.m. It wasn't all about him. Maybe this is about something I need to address. And that's a great strategy for opening the door in a very non-threatening way that both partners can get their needs met.
Fantastic. So I know our time is coming to an end. And so I just want to, first of all, kind of go over my biggest takeaways. Linz, I'd love you to add yours. And then Wendy, please correct us or add anything that we missed. But I think really enlightening things for me were this idea about these recurrent night awakenings becoming a habit.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never really thought about it that way, but I even reflect on my own behaviors. And yes, I've developed habits around it. And if I can undo some of those habits, I might be able to embrace even the rest that is occurring with being awake at those time periods instead of the frustration and doing other things. So I think that was really important for me to hear. I mean, this one's just always so important to me. I think letting women know the underdiagnosis of sleep apnea through this time frame. Linz, I know you've shared your story multiple times, but I think that we have this stereotypical picture in our heads of what people with sleep apnea look like, and that's just not true for midlife women sometimes. And so that we need to be aware of that. Linz, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple. And one, I think, is just having compassion and like a little bit of patience with yourself, that this is not a, pristine environment where we're trying to execute on the following. It's just like we're trying to go to sleep. So just a little bit of grace with yourself in that process. Even though now we appreciate sleep, it doesn't mean it's like another one of those hardcore to-dos that you need to stress yourself out over. You'll find your way there, and there are lots of different tips and tricks on how to do it. I do like the idea of treating a sleep test kind of like you treat an annual physical. Like, just go do it. Find out if something's changed in your dynamic so that you have the right support in place. And this willingness to experiment with, do you sleep with a partner or not, and without attaching judgment on the relationship quality based on, do you need a different way to sleep? I love that.
Wendy, what else would you like our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I love all of that. And again, just to sort of practically break down some ways that you can break that habit of getting stressed or worried in bed. If you're going to have those awakenings, yes, first step is always having some grace about it. As you said, Lindsley, like if we can just sort of accept some of this is normal. Again, waking up in the middle of the night is not the problem. It's the inability to fall back to sleep. If you struggle to fall back to sleep, and if you start, making lists, worrying about it, calculating how many hours of sleep you have left and how bad you're going to feel tomorrow, that's really creating the habit you want to break. So my recommendation there, sort of the most stringent version of this technique, is to actually get out of bed and go to another room and read a book or do something relaxing. If that seems just awful and you're not willing to do it, I'm now sort of suggesting to women, okay, here's another strategy to try. You could try to read a book in bed by, a Kindle, something that's not going to disrupt your partner, keeping the light low. You could even, use an eye mask that has Bluetooth speakers in it so you could listen to relaxing music or a story or a podcast. The idea is, let's break this habit of nightly letting your brain go hog wild at 3 o'clock in the morning, because then it becomes trained to do so. So again, try these strategies. That the first one is truly the most evidence-based approach, but I realize many people don't want to do that. So you can try some of these other strategies. But the key is to really distract yourself from the fact that you're not sleeping, and then you might get sleepy again. And to your point, Lindsley, about sort of having some grace and, and not trying to perfect the art of sleep. As I always tell my clients, the more you chase sleep, the more it will elude you. You need to allow sleep to come to you, because ultimately we sleep best when we feel safe and secure. Now, if we are approaching sleep with like gritted teeth and like the start of a race, we do not want, our cortisol and adrenaline pumping to, grind out sleep. It just won't work. That's not going to send the signal to our brain that the world is safe and secure. So have some grace, set yourself up for success by practicing good self-care, by unwinding before bed in an appropriate, relaxing and pleasurable way, and also just allow yourself to allow sleep to come and have some grace when it doesn't. And again, don't practice the habit of being, awake and frustrated in bed. If you're not sleeping at that point, you can get out of bed.
So where can people find you?
So on most sort of social media sites, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc., I'm Dr. Wendy Troxel. I also have a website, wendytroxel.com. I have a couple
Last
of,
name, Wendy, for people.
pardon me?
If they're listening, how do you spell your last name?
Oh, thank you. Wendy, so it's Dr. Dr. Wendy, Wendy, Troxel, Troxel, Dr. Wendy Troxel. I also have a couple of TED Talks out there, one on school start times and teenagers' sleep or the lack thereof. And I also have a TED Talk on couples and sleep. And of course, there's my book, Sharing the Covers, Every Couple's Guide to Better Sleep.
And I will say this, and I would say this to any other sleep expert that we had on. I have found your book probably one of the most helpful books on sleep that I've read, because it meets you kind of where you are and helps you solve those problems instead of trying to adapt this lab language, etc. So big plug for
Thank you so much.
For your book, because I found it just so insightful and so much of the behavioral components that went with it that I just underestimated, to be very honest with you. So, well, thank you for your time. We so enjoyed having you on, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your stories with all of us. So, and yeah, I'm gonna bring you to Canyon Ranch. We need you. We're gonna work on. We're gonna do some sleep work there for sure.
I cannot wait. I think we can
Awesome. Thanks
really
so much.
impact
We'll talk
people.
to you soon.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us here today. If you liked what you heard and you got some tips on how to live better right now and for the long haul, please help us reach more midlife women. Please share and rate and like this show, and we can't wait to continue the dialogue with you on our next episode. Until then, thank you. It's time.